Salamualaykum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Everyone, this is Ahmed Mauer, aka Mr. Middle Path. And in this video, I have with me brother Michael Ibrahim. MashaAllah, he is an educator, been an educator for how many years, brother?
11.
11, MashaAllah. And compared to me, I've been an educator for second year now. So we see we are bringing an expert on board, subject matter expert, talk about the public school system in America. And hopefully this will transfer over some of my other subscribers that are in Europe and in Britain. There probably are some similarities, might be some differences, but inshallah, we're going to learn about public schooling system as it relates to Muslims and as it also relates to the modern masculinity mess that we find ourselves in today. So without further ado, please, brother, introduce yourselves to the people watching and, say a few words, inshallah, before we start.
Bismillah, Salamualaykum. Peace be upon all of you. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me, brother. Yeah, so my name is Michael Abraham. I'm a public school teacher in the city of Minneapolis in South Minneapolis. I taught in Saudi Arabia. Originally is actually where I started teaching, so I've been in private education there, taught at a charter school. I've taught in elementary and high school. About 5 years ago, I created an educator professional development program called Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools, which is also a book now that's available on Amazon. So while working as a teacher, I also do a lot of educating of educators themselves about Muslim kids and about Islam. And people can check out my website, abrahameducation.com, or me on YouTube and Instagram to learn more about that. And I've been doing that work for 5 years, the professional development work. And this past summer, I'm not much of a social media person, but I decided to get online and start joining some of these conversations going on about the youth and about kids in school, because you learn a lot about kids working as a teacher, obviously. And, I agree with all the anxiety that exists about the public school system. And there's much, there's a lot of criticisms to be made about it that I agree with. At the same time, there's opportunity in there as well for us to advance our causes as Muslims, to connect with kids. And the reality is most of our kids are in public schools. So we have to actually be in the places that our kids are in. We actually have to be advocating for them in those places. So, I caught your video about, I think you were, what's it called? The Lost Boys presentation, and I actually didn't realize you were a teacher when I was watching that. A lot of the things you were talking about were very correct as far as these concerns we have about the kids. A lot of those issues, there's opportunities to talk to kids about those things and begin having interventions of those things early on if we're involved in the public school system. So I did a few podcasts with Gabriel Romani in the summer. And when I saw that, I asked him to connect with you because I saw that you'd been on the Three Muslims podcast. And here we are now.
Alhamdulillah, man. It's glad to have someone like you on board. So I would like to ask you a question. How long were you teaching in Saudi?
Yeah, I was in Saudi from 2010 to 2013.
So let's start off with this. My first question would be, what would be the differences you have seen between teaching in Saudi and teaching in the public school system here? And then also what you were telling me before we started the podcast, which was that the public schools you are in have actually a huge majority of Muslims in those public schools. So I guess the comparison of the school system in Saudi versus the public school system with a lot of Muslims in it versus the public school system with very little Muslims in it. You've taught all three of those environments, correct?
That's correct. And I've worked with educators in all those environments as well. So Saudi was really a unique situation when I was there because I was in 2010 and I think it was either 2007, maybe 2008 when King Abdullah, he made a decree to allow Saudi nationals to begin taking international education programs. So like a British education curriculum or American education curriculum before that was only available to expatriates. So while I was there, I was actually working at a Saudi private school, an elementary school, that was trying to implement as best they could an American curriculum alongside the Saudi curriculum to the extent that they had an understanding about an American curriculum. And that was actually something we were trying to figure out there. So oddly enough, while I was in Saudi, I actually ended up learning a lot about American education. And I went there. I didn't have a teaching license when I was there. I did that when I came back after 3 years. My bachelor's degree was in political science. So ironically, I ended up learning a lot about American education while I was in Saudi. Saudi, you know, it was, I mean, there was organization was something happening in Saudi. It was a work in progress there, you know. A major difference between the perception, I would say, that the Muslim world gives people about educational systems versus the American system is generally education is something very top down in the Muslim world. You know, so you have a Ministry of Education. They create books for each topic. Those books are passed down to the teachers, and the teachers go through those books from A to Z. You know, American education doesn't work that way at all. It's extremely different. And that's something that people, Muslims especially, really need to understand about the American education, because a lot of times people think about the education system and operate and relate to it as if it's much more top down than it really is. The 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution gives the autonomy to the states to decide on what the education program is in their states. And even beyond that, the general culture in education is that most decisions are made at the district level. And even beyond that, teacher union contracts give which not every school is a teacher, not every school has a teacher force that is part of a union, but most districts do. And, you know, charter schools usually don't, but most district schools do.
For those,
and the,
go ahead. What a charter school is for us.
I'm sorry?
Can you please explain what a charter school is for those that might not know what it is?
Yeah, and something people do need to know, you know, a charter school is a public school, because I hear a lot of people will say that they speak about a charter school as if it's something different than public school. It's not. So the public schools, you know, you will either have a district school generally or a charter school. They might call the district, I think in Virginia, they call the districts divisions. But a district school is going to have been around longer because the charter system has really only been around about 30 years. And the district system, you know, the districts will be organized at the state level, and the districts have a geographical boundary, and they have a legal obligation usually within the state to serve every student within that boundary. So each student will have a school, depending on where they live, that they're assigned to go to, unless they choose to go otherwise, and the amount of school choice that families have vary from state to state. You know, some major differences, there's usually more money in district schools, because district schools will, the general structure, things can vary state to state, but the general structure is with each student in a school, the state government gives that school a certain amount of money for each student. But on top of that, district schools will also get money from the property taxes of whatever city they're in or whatever district they're in. Charter schools virtually never get money from property taxes. Charter schools are usually started by an independent entity. They usually will have some organization that oversees them, which can vary in the degree of supervision that actually entails. And it's usually going to be like a nonprofit or a university or something. And they will have, you know, they won't be subject to a district's curriculum because they will set it more on their own at the charter school level, unless they're a consortium of charter schools or a charter school organization. So a lot of times charter schools are started by like individuals who have a vision and you know, and they can have leadership that's very devoted in that way. Whereas the districts are more of the old school system. But something that is commonly a problem in charter schools, not always, is they have a lot of teacher turnover, and they tend to have a lot more younger teachers because they typically can't pay as well. And that's part of why they don't have unions, because these districts almost always have union contracts with the teachers.
Was the high turnover rate from lack of funds or from a different reason?
Yeah, usually they usually can't afford to pay teachers beyond what a district would pay a teacher within their first 5 years. That's very common. It's not 100% the case. You know, that gap in funding they get by not getting money from property taxes, they will try to make it up by getting funds from educational organizations or corporations or this type of stuff. There's different ways that you can do that, and it depends on the charter school themselves, you know, and the people running the organization. But it's very common that charter schools teacher turnover is a thing, and a lot of times they have young teachers because it's where you can get the jobs initially. And once you get a few years of experience, you know, in a district school with a teacher union, there's a really, teacher contracts will have a very clear grid of how the salary structure works, where you have the years of experience going down and your education going across. So there's a really predictable salary trajectory in schools with teacher unions and in teacher contracts.
So how does that compare to Saudi?
Well, Saudi, I mean, when I went to Saudi, you know, actually starting teaching in Saudi was a little better than having starting teaching here, especially because at least at that time they did not have they didn't tax you. I think that's changed now, but you didn't pay for taxes. The other thing about Saudi, your school would pay for your living accommodations as well. So you weren't paying rent if you came there as an expat, especially as an expat from the West. You get privileges having an American passport there. They'd also pay for you to travel back home during the summer. So Saudi was nice. Now, something about teacher union contracts, they give you a lot of autonomy as a teacher. And this is something people don't understand a lot as well, because a lot of the conversations that happen in media and things relating to the public school system, I mean, it's like anything else, like it's a really convoluted conversation. It doesn't relate to much reality that actually goes on in classrooms. And a reality of schools is the biggest factor that influences what goes on in a classroom is the discretion of the teacher. And teacher union contracts, especially, they almost guarantee that that's the case, because they limit the amount that that teacher's classroom can even be observed, and they limit the accountability measures upon them. So teachers within the classrooms have a lot of choices that they can make. And even in charter schools will have less of that, but the culture of education being set by the teachers union still makes it so that's often an expectation there as well.
So you are not talking about Saudi right now. You're talking about America.
Yeah, I'm talking about America. And the thing I was getting to in Saudi, like, you may have a lot more top-down control from the school.
Right. You can't
This type of
just
thing.
do whatever you want.
Yeah, not necessarily, but I mean, it depends, teaching, and in any place too, you have legal obligations that you agree to when you get a teaching license that you have to abide by, obviously. And I'm not talking about compromising anything like that, but just generally in education, you have a lot of autonomy as a teacher, and the general culture of education is set by the structures put together by teachers unions. So your accountability measures as a teacher are getting observations throughout the year, which are often very limited to 3 or 4. So it's not like you have someone supervising you really closely in the classroom, this type of thing.
So I think this perspective, the perspective of the educator, I want to come back to it later.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this from the point of view of someone watching this. This is interesting, but I think what a lot of people might want to know is, okay, let's address the stereotype that people have, which is that you go to public school, you see kids smoking weed in the hallways, girls in mini skirts chatting up boys in the hallways, people going outside to have sex in their cars between classes. And I'm exaggerating here, but I'm throwing out the most obvious stereotypes that we have of the public school system here in America, right? From Arab scene movies, and then from what we live here, we all know that parents have a huge fear of saying, okay, we don't want to send our kids to public school. So is that fear warranted? And if it is warranted, you being someone who's taught in all of these different places, mashallah, do you think that it makes a difference whether a kid goes to a public school in Saudi versus a public school in America versus a private Islamic school in America? Like, I think that is what I was trying to get at. What do you see as the environmental differences in the behavior of the students on average,
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, it doesn't make a difference. I mean, again, there's legitimate criticisms to be made about the public school system. And the stereotype you're talking about, I mean, it does exist in some places, but I do think it's a little overblown in people's minds. I don't discourage anyone from sending their kid to an Islamic school, and from what I've seen, people who attend Islamic schools, they generally turn out pretty well. A lot of the brothers I know, especially ones who are more oriented towards the deen, which Muslims in public education tend to maybe be so less, but ones who are in education and oriented towards the deen, they tend to be involved in Islamic schools or pushing for Islamic schools. And I don't disagree with that push at all. But it's just a reality that kids are in public schools. And for many families in the country, many Muslim families, it's not even a choice. And even families who have anxiety about the public schools and could send their kid to Islamic schools, a lot of them end up choosing to send their kid to the public schools anyway for a variety of different reasons. Now, I will say the stereotype you're describing about all the vices and things, I mean, all that stuff exists. This is all concerns, but we have kids in the system, and we need to intervene with them. And also, too, a lot of those vices, I would say it's a misperception with people the extent to which how bad those things are. Not to say there isn't horror stories here or there, But statistically, those things were at their worst in this country. They're at their peak in the 1990s, and they've only gone down since then. And I argue that a big reason they have gone down is because of the influx of immigrant families that we've had into the country, because 2000 to 2010 was the biggest decade of immigration in this country's history. But a lot of that especially those of us who grew up in the 90s, we start imagining that things have only gotten worse since then amongst kids. And if you think like that, and you know how bad things were in the 90s, you think it's absolutely awful. But statistics don't actually bear that out. And you look like you have something to say, so I won't say more.
So the comment that people make when they say immigration is going to ruin the country is actually the opposite. It's making it better.
It's completely the opposite, especially regarding adolescent behavior. Now, those immigrant communities, they experience a corruption of their kids that is, harrowing to them and not what they expect or want based on their home cultural expectations. But the net effect is that an influx of immigrant children into a school system or a school district has a positive effect on the health behavior choices of the students in this district. And I know this in a very practical way, having dealt with educators in suburban districts who've dealt with a large influx of Muslim students into their school system over the past 20 years. And, having kids from a different demographic, overtake a certain percentage of your school population brings certain challenges with it. And there's things they need to understand about Islam than being Muslim and all this type of thing. But I will hear frequently from those educators that they have less kids doing drugs, less kids having sex and this type of thing than they had before. And that's a relief, because when kids do those things, it brings a lot of stress into those schools. Now, on the flip side, the immigrant community has experienced that as well. We do have some kids partaking in that, and even just some is too many, so that anxiety is not unwarranted. But, overall, it's, statistically, if you look at purely American society, things are better with those behaviors now than they were in the 90s.
So what are the statistics on that? Do you have any, do you remember any off the top of your head, like the 90s statistics versus now? And like, what is the difference in how much these behaviors have gone down?
I don't have the specific statistics in front of me, though I have some videos on my YouTube and Instagram where I talk about it. I have a video, I think it's titled, "This is not the worst generation of children ever."
I actually came to that conclusion too. They're not that bad,
No, they're not. There is a book published by the American Psychological Association in 2011 called "The Immigrant Paradox in Children in America." And that book that's a book where each chapter is a different research study and going over it, so it's kind of a technical book like that. But it overwhelmingly draws the conclusion that the more assimilated a child is into American culture, the more likely they are to make poor health choices. And amongst immigrant families, the children who assimilate less make better health outcome choices and have better educational outcomes. Leonard Sachs, he's another, he's a psychologist. His books have some of these statistics as well. So, the rates of everyone knows the rates of depression have gone up in kids. The rates of anxiety have gone up in kids. And the unfortunate thing for this current generation is they're way more overexposed to things because of the internet and social media and all this stuff than kids were before. So they're suffering the ill effects of that, and social media, with the perception that people have of the kids. If you take something like drug use, for kids who really initiate drug use in adolescence, a big motivator for them is the social reward they get from doing it. Because adolescents are motivated by portraying independence to their peers, because they know they're not fully independent, and the more autonomous they can look, the more grown up they look, and that looks cool. So, in the 90s, so one of the motivations for doing drugs can be that you're making your own choice as an adolescent, and you don't care what other people say and this type of thing. So for an adolescent in the 90s, in order to show off that they're doing that, they would have to invite a dozen kids over to their parents' house when the parents aren't there, do the drugs in the garage or whatever, and get all the other kids involved in it. And then maybe they talk about it, and that's how they develop their reputation as a rebel or whatever. Now with social media, the kid who's that initiator, they don't have to invite anyone over. They can just take a little video of themselves doing it, post it on Snapchat, and then hundreds of kids are going to see it. One of those kids might repost it on Twitter or somewhere. Some adults might get a hold of it, and before you know it, 50,000 people might see it. So that one kid did it in isolation, He did it in isolation, didn't involve anyone else, but his motivation to get the social reward for it caused him to show off about it in a way that it goes viral, and it has the impact as if 50,000 kids did it. Whereas in the 90s, you'd only have the impact of 12 kids doing it or so, this type of thing. So this is kind of the dynamic that's going on right now with the way that we're looking at young people.
That's interesting. You know, I'm thinking about the whole dynamic that's going on, where we're talking about how in the 90s or like a decade ago it was actually worse off, whereas right now it's technically better off in terms of those problem behaviors.
Overall statistics, yeah.
Why do people not feel that way? Like, why do we sound the alarm bells? Because before I've talked to you, I've actually never heard of this. And I'm sure most people have not actually heard of this. Everyone is, the perception or the common perception everyone has, like, oh my God, everything is just so much worse now than it ever was before.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a few things. And, I'm not saying there aren't some things that aren't worse and some things that aren't bigger challenges. For one thing, for immigrant communities, again, like of course, there were Muslim immigrants here in the 90s. And in the second chapter of my book, Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools, I actually have a very good layout of the history of Muslim immigration here and how that has affected school student populations in the country. But, the biggest influx of Muslim immigrants that we had by far was in the decade from 2000 to 2010. And that put a huge influx of Muslim kids into the school system during that time. And that only continues up till now. Now, for immigrant populations and immigrant parents, they really don't care what things were like in the 90s at the end of the day. They care about how their kids are relative to their own religious and cultural expectations, which is totally reasonable. So that's the thing about it. Within Muslim communities, it's probably accurate that things are worse. So when we speak about not being worse, I mean, it's really relative to the overall.
I mean, relative to the overall American society. That's
correct. Correct. But the thing about understanding this dynamic is kids in the society, Muslim kids in the society and in the public school system, they're going to compare themselves relative to other people in the society, generally, not just other Muslim kids they go to school with, and even other non-Muslim adults who they interact with, and of course, things they see on media. And there is plenty of our kids who have this perception that everyone is worried that things are so bad with them, but they don't feel like they're doing anything that wrong.
Yeah.
The other dynamic why it feels so bad, I believe, is what I explained about the effects of media and how we're just able to see things more now than we were.
What about non-immigrant Muslims? Second gen, third gen Muslims that have been living in this country, before when their parents came, like their parents were raised in this country. They're children of their parents, and they're like a third generation or second generation, or maybe even coming from a convert family, or the African American community, the Muslims that have been here for, generations. So what about, do you have any observations on those Muslims in the country?
Yeah, I do, but I mean, you're one of them, aren't you? So you should probably comment on it.
I am technically born in Egypt, actually. I am first generation. I look like I might have been like 100th generation, but I'm actually first gen.
Okay. So
yeah.
I mean, what I've seen from, if we take second generation Muslims who are maybe getting to middle age now, or others who are maybe in, or even first gen like yourself, ones who are adults now. What I see amongst that age group, there's a lot of talk about identity conflicts. Everyone knows Muslim youth go through identity conflicts. And this is even recognized in educational research about Muslim students. I have more on that in my book as well. But, adolescents, I don't want to say they deal with identity conflicts better, but they, in a way, they handle them more fluidly because adolescents have very flexible minds. So they're very good at adjusting who they are from one context to another. And sometimes that can confuse us about, who they really are, or what a snapshot of their behavior will cause us to think about them overall. But, as the human mind gets older, it gets more stiff. So what I see with people, with Muslims who've grown up here and, handling this identity conflict through adolescence and their teenage years, but maybe not being so explicitly aware of it. It's more just something that they're reacting through. Once you get into your 20s, and you have to be out in the world, and you have to create a presentation of yourself in the world, and you have to make decisions about what you really want to do with your life. And also your mind wants you to get in more into a routine in life, especially as you get into your 30s and middle age. And you can't just be changing who you are from place to place. It's almost like then you got to decide. So the secular kind of party person you were when you went to school or around a heterogeneous group of friends or whatever, you have to kind of choose between being more like that or more the person that you were in the masjid on the weekend school and this type of thing. So, I mean, I see that as like the identity conflicts in a lot of ways. They maybe hit the second generation Muslims more in their 20s and will probably hit them hardest in their middle age, actually. And I think that this is going to be a core thing that is going to be part of the, yeah, I mean, there's a pattern to a midlife crisis that people go through. So like growing up in this mixed way, I do think it will cause Muslims who've grown up here, especially if they've compromised in a lot of different situations and haven't had a solid foundation, one identity or the other. I think that'll put them through a certain type of midlife crisis. At the same time, I think a lot of the Muslims that people have anxiety about and the path they're on in their 20s, when they do go through a midlife crisis, that might be a very good time to call them back to the deen. But we have to be ready for it and have to start thinking about how to do that now. And this actually happened with the baby boomers in the society. And a lot of times the Muslims who grew up here, I think they're comparable to the baby boomers in a lot of ways, in that the baby boom generation here, which is the generation my parents are from, they just went through a liberalization compared to their parents, and they got this sense of empowerment that they could cast off what their parents were all about. But a lot of them did revert back to being more conservative when they got to middle ages. And that's what the Reagan Revolution was all about in the 1980s and the televangelist movement of the late 70s and 1980s in America. That was a kind of conservative backlash at middle age amongst lapsed baby boomers, or baby boomers who are lapsed hippies.
So I think I want to make two comments. First of all, I want to correct myself on saying that I'm first gen, because I was born in Egypt, but I came here when I was 2. So the other thing that I wanted to say was I have noticed what you're talking about, because before I was a teacher, I was actually in counseling and therapy and psychology and so forth. And what I noticed is the living out of a double life between Muslims, right? So especially if we're talking about Muslims that are into drugs or into certain vices, there's a double life literally where they are one person at night and one person during the day. And that takes a serious toll where they have to make that choice. They can't stay in that double life forever, as you commented. But then even Muslims that are not doing vices, right, have to make certain choices at the end of the day about how they want to present themselves, right? And do they want to present themselves as more of a Muslim firmly, or do they just want to go about their daily lives and really not bring any attention to that? And that is something that they face. And last but not least is I want to get your thoughts on this, whether there's statistics on this or not. But have you noticed a surge in Muslim? I don't want. It sounds corny or cheesy, but like Muslim pride or Muslim identity or people.
At the school I teach at a school that's 90% Muslim, and I'm in my 6th year there. I would say I have seen some ebb and flow there within that context. Here in the Twin Cities, sometimes local communities have their own, they have their own dynamics. We've had some certain dynamics here that have contributed to some ebb and flow. I will say, I think that an ebb and flow in this is natural. Another thing I will say too, working with so many educators who teach Muslim kids in my consultancy, I will say that, even amongst kids who we think as being liberalized or being on this path or that or whatever off, to their non-Muslim teachers, those kids still look religious to them. It's still apparent to them that being Muslim really matters to those kids, and that they have a specific things about them that matter because they're Muslim. Like the whole kind of anxiety about liberalism conversation that we have in our community, and not saying that that's illegitimate or anything, but like the non-Muslim teachers around these kids, they don't really perceive that. I would say, they see the kids, they will attribute to their non-religious behaviors or their impious behaviors to developmental factors, that are relatively normal for kids growing up, Now how we want them to react to them as adults in their lives, that's something we need to teach those educators about. That's what I try to do with my work. It's also why we need to be in the public schools ourselves. So, I mean, that's what I would say about it. But I will say, I do think that an ebb and flow is natural. Here in the community here, there's been a problem, in my time here in education, we've gone through a problem with drugs, specifically opioids, especially like in the city here. I would say I'm starting to see now the kids I have, instead of being curious about that, they've seen older people who experience the full brunt of the negative effects of that. And they know they're not getting into it. And they're of the orientation now, actually, I want to do something about that when I get older. You get what I'm saying? So this type of ebb and flow, I think is fairly natural.
That's very interesting. So, and that would fall in line with your statistic that kids are actually doing less drugs than they were before.
Well, I mean, I'm talking about within the last even just 6-7 years, as far as this ebb and flow with the opioid crisis.
Yes.
But the less kids doing drugs overall, that's on a trajectory of the society overall. Going back. So another thing I want to say that I've always seen with kids, and especially teaching English, and a project I always have my students do is they write an autobiography about themselves. That I make them do it pretty elaborately while we're studying the autobiography of Malcolm X. And you get a whole different look at kids when you get to see them doing reflective writing, especially when you give them a lot of time with it. I will say there are hardly, my perception, and I get this from educators who I consult with as well, there's hardly any of our kids to whom being Muslim does not matter. Like everyone sees that. There is the largest statistical survey ever done of Muslim kids was done by New York City public schools in 2010. That showed that 98% of Muslim kids, and they surveyed thousands, said that religion was important in their lives. And they were 3 times more likely than the non-Muslim kids to say that religion was important in their lives. So there's very, very few of our kids for whom being Muslim is not important. Now, how you live out Islam in the society, I think that's a whole different question for them. And what you're talking about, the duality thing, this dual identity thing, it's very hard for immigrants' parents, and the immigrant Muslim communities have meant a lot to me in my life. So I criticize them lightly, and I don't even really mean to criticize them. And they have a lot of reasons why they need to be concerned about being stigmatized. But, they themselves have struggled to be fully Muslim in non-Muslim contexts. So that type of duality, and you can call it code switching in psychology, of being one person in one place, another person in a different place. They've seen that modeled in their parents to a large degree, and they've seen the Muslim community do it generally in a certain degree, because we talk differently in certain contexts versus another, and we're highly sensitive and highly worried about the way that we're being perceived, and worried that people are going to stereotype us and all this, And I honestly understand immigrants being that way. Like it's hard for me to fault them for that. I do think that for people like yourself who've grown up here, and those of us who have grown up here, we have an obligation to take education about Islam and the society to another level, and take our assertion about it for another level. And, for the sake of the kids first and foremost, and engaging, and I'm promoting my book and my training here, and I have an online course.
Please go for it. Go
yeah, ahead. I mean, for families and even young people who can go back to the schools they went to, engaging your kids' school about the fact that them being Muslim is important to you, doing something like giving them my book or recommending my professional development course, which they can access through abrahameducation.com, and letting the kid know that you're doing that, or bringing it up to a teacher in front of them at a parent-teacher conference or something. Even just a small act like that is something that can have a big impact on the kid, because it's saying to the kid, okay, in this context of the school where I have a non-Muslim teacher, me being Muslim still matters to my parents. And, another big thing I push for is for young Muslims to really consider getting into teaching. And it doesn't have to be, we don't really, something you talked about in that Lost Boys presentation was some downfalls of the way we prioritize careers in the Muslim community. And our lack of priority over teaching, especially for males, we're suffering from that, because
no masculine role models.
not only no masculine role models, but no masculine Muslim role models.
Mhm.
So it's very easy for kids to like, act the way they're supposed to in the weekend schools and in the masjid, but then they go to the public school on Monday through Friday. They just code switch and act an entirely different being, and they don't see anyone else doing anything else.
So is it that they don't have the confidence to assert their, I don't want to say dominance, but to assert themselves in an environment that doesn't necessarily know who or what they stand for or what they are?
Yeah, I mean, confidence is definitely a big thing, but also just when have they seen someone else do it?
Mhm.
They need a model of someone, explicitly doing it,
I remember one time I was with a revert brother one time, we were walking by, and some sister, not sister, she was a non-Muslim, a neighbor of mine, like she knew my friend's mom and stuff like that. So she tried to like reach over, and it's normal in their culture, right? She tried to reach over and like touch my beard, or like touch me in a certain way, and I politely, like, with my body language made it clear that I'm not okay with that, but I was still very polite with her.
Mhm.
And I remember the Reaver brother looked at me, he's like, yo, that was so educational for me. Now I know what to do in that situation, because I'm always in those weird and awkward situations. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I see where you're coming from in that point.
Mhm.
This begs the question though, uh, is there a modern masculinity crisis? Like, if the numbers are so much lower than it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago, and drug use is much lower, are sexual behaviors lower, by the way?
Yeah, yeah,
They
kids are
are.
having
Okay.
kids are having sex less than they used to. I mean,
Wow.
that has everything to do with the influx of immigrants too. However, actually
Is there a
too,
modern masculinity crisis then, or are we just overblowing things out of proportion?
well, I mean, I wouldn't say that, like, I mean, there's challenges for both males and females, you
Mhm.
know. Um, the thing about the Western world and the developed world, because the Muslim world is on a different developmental trajectory as far as industrialization than the Western world. So a lot of the Muslim world is still closer to a time where their primary modes of subsistence were linked to physical labor. Whereas in a fully developed world, your mode of subsistence is linked to getting a paycheck, which means it's linked to intellectual work. So the dynamic here is we don't know what to do with people adolescent age except try to prolong their adolescence. And then there's all these market forces that try to manipulate that as well, because to really participate effectively in the economy in a strong way here and in the mode of subsistence, you have to do intellectual work. So you need to be long you need to be further along in your intellectual development in order to do that in a fully developed society. Whereas, and I mean, take like East Africans, where a lot of them, they come from pastoralist societies. It was common at 8, 9 years old, the kid starts going off on the grazing expeditions with the father, and then doing their own one by age 14, 15, you
So
know,
they're already an independent man,
correct.
technically by 14, 15. Yeah.
Correct. I mean, the closer your society is linked, its mode of subsistence is linked to physical labor, the younger people can enter the adult roles of society. Now,
Mm.
obviously, the Muslim world is developing very fastly, and it's a generation or two, where it hasn't been that way, at least in most places. But here in American society, it's been that way for a long time.
Mhm.
So it's really this. It's not just masculinity crisis; it's a becoming adult crisis.
I see.
Because especially beginning with the baby boom generation. They're the first generation that they had a prolonged adolescence. They really wanted that culturally amongst themselves, and then they had when they were young adults, they had a very strong economy. They had a very easy economy, and they didn't raise a millennial generation to really value the values you need to struggle and work hard and mature quickly, to enter adult roles in society. And that's why,
Why is that?
because my opinion is overall they had it too easy. Most baby boomers from the society, they quickly became wealthier than the families they grew up in. So they were poor in their childhood, but had wealth, throughout adulthood. And simply getting a college degree was enough to have a lifelong career for them, for the most part. So they raised the millennials with the same attitude,
Mhm.
or just they raised the millennials. The millennials didn't have it as hard as them as in childhood because their parents had been through the Great Depression. But but for them, you know, they raise kids who grew up with a higher socioeconomic status, generally speaking. And, you know, they raise them with the impression, you know, thinking that like them, you'll just get through college and then you'll have a
everything
career
is good.
Yeah, and people still think that way. And then you know, the universities, you know, they developed a whole you know, profession around this with the loan system and these cushy retirements that academics are getting in this type of thing from that baby boom generation. And that's put all these forces in place in the public school system that just gets kids on this get loans and go into college conveyor belt. When in my opinion, for most kids, going into college quickly is not the best choice for them to do at all. And of course, as Muslims, you have the extra considerations with student loans. So I mean, there's a lot of people in the millennial generation, but it's males in particular who you know, they're dropped out of life as fully blown adults. You know,
Why are they dropped out of life? Because this is something I've heard. You know, school is stupid. I don't want to do school. What's the point? Is this something that you have experienced, and how common is this mentality?
Yeah, and look, in school, boys are doing way worse than girls. I mean, everyone knows that. You know, almost any high school you take, on average, their honor roll is going to be 60% female, 40% male.
Wow.
If with students of color, that's going to be 70-30, if not an even wider gap. You know, there's a Somali engineer here in the Twin Cities who's been here a long time, and he with a sociologist who works at the University of Minnesota, they did a analysis of the names of graduating classes at the University of Minnesota, and they found that 9 out of 10 kids graduating from the University of Minnesota with Somali names, 9 out of 10 of them were female. So you see that gap very largely.
It's a huge gap.
You know, it's well known. I mean, it's a problem in education that's not addressed. And on the ground level, educators, they consider the psychological gender differences and just the gender differences between boys and girls very strongly. Like on the ground level, teachers know that. That's really been a big part of child psychology for a long time. So on the ground level, people consider that very heavily. You know, at the media level or the larger societal discussion level, you know, there's all these politics that get into that discussion. But I mean, it's well known that girls mature faster than boys, and they definitely develop abstract thinking before boys do. Definitely develop fine motor skills at a faster rate than boys do. And all those things complement them doing better in the public school system than boys. Girls are also more likely to be compliance motivated than boys. And if you are compliance motivated, that's really what makes you do well in public school. You know, you follow
to your teacher, and that's it.
Correct. Yeah. You follow the directions as you're told. You know, and even those boys who will be on the honor roll system, they're likely to be the minority of boys who are compliance motivated themselves. Mm-hmm. You know, and you know, a thing about that too with a lot of kids is even with them, a lot of those kids who do have success, if they're only compliance motivated, they don't always develop an internal motivation for learning necessarily. You know, they just develop a motivation to please others, and that's something that actually runs out later in life, and they have
that problems. Has its own problems too. Yeah. I see where.
But you know, so with boys, especially in adolescence, you see this sort of emotional psychological coping going on with their lack of success. You know, and they are usually extremely insecure about school and doing anything academic at that point. So, you know, the whole too cool for school angle, you know, that develops as an emotional defense mechanism in that, you know, and then, you know, maybe it carries on, you know, it carries on.
Kind of like when you can't have the candy, you're like, I didn't want the candy anyways.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
I see where you're coming from. I did, when I was doing my master's in education psychology, I did a lot of research and work on whether single sex schools are better. Mm-hmm. And the research tends to show that it actually is a lot better for boys and girls. Yeah. You know,
there was a charter school, pretty much all Latino student charter school here in the Twin Cities, that a few years ago they split it by gender because of sexual harassment that girls were experiencing. Yeah, they split the classes by gender. This was a elementary middle school. And after they split it by gender, the enrollment demand shot up. They had a waiting list, like a bunch of other, and this is all within the Latino community. A bunch of other families wanted their kids in those schools, and I've seen similar research as well. I mean, bullying problems go down. You know, less disengagement goes down in schools when you have a switch gender. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea. You know, in the public system, it's hard to make happen. Although there is actually, in my school district, they have a department specifically for African American males and working on their motivation. There, and my school has done some things sometimes where we've done activities particular to boys and girls and this type of thing. Like it's not like schools aren't totally closed off to it as you might think. And again, if you work day to day with kids, the dynamics of gender differences aren't something that you really deny at all, and you deal with it day to day.
So I think the key takeaways here so far is that the Muslims, I'm not going to say everyone, but the Muslims in public schools are not doing as bad as what the Muslim community thinks they are. They're actually doing much better than what we think they are, and they're doing much better than the previous generations, from what I understand. However, there is still some type of masculinity crisis, which you termed as transition into adulthood crisis, because the nature of the economy here is that you can't really enter the workforce until way later anyways. So that, and then I do want to ask this question because I know that probably a lot of people will have this on their mind with all these reaction videos we get to LGBTQ stuff in schools and all this. Like, really, I'm sure that I just want to say, perhaps behaviors and modes of thinking that most people, even non-Muslims, think are not appropriate to be pushed on such young ages. Mm-hmm. When I'm speaking with parents, they're saying, "Oh, I know an aunt or a cousin or a family member, one of my nieces or one of my nephews went into public school. Now they're talking about, well, what's really wrong with, being gay, or what's really wrong with." So, do you have any comment on that? Is that a problem? And I think a lot of Muslim families, when I ask them, why don't you want to send your kids to, when they're asked, why don't you want to send your kids to public school? I think they say that as one of the main factors, not even drugs or anything like that anymore. It's mainly speaking with the opposite gender as problem number one. And then problem number two is LGBTQ ideology.
Oh yeah, this is what everyone brings up to me too, is the first thing. I mean, as far as saying like there's not real, there's problems with kids. Like I don't mean to downplay the fact that there's problems, but what scares us tends to stick out more, in our minds than positive things. Like there are positive things going on. With the LGBT stuff, I do think it's a little overblown overall, to be honest. Like with my experience, working at a big districts, working at people at the district level, working with people from different districts, a lot of different educators, I do think it's a little overblown. I mean, now kids do get pushed in this, there is no Western society has lost its foundations. So no one knows, one of the biggest problems with the school system is they don't know what message to give to kids other than like this be yourself type of message, and it's the same in media and entertainment. And that's actually an anxiety inducing message to the kids. I mean, there's a degree everyone has to self-discover in this type of thing. But I personally think overall, that's an anxiety inducing message to kids, because kids are inherently changing and developing. And when you tell them just be yourself, a lot of times the message they get is, oh, I'm supposed to know what I am already, but I don't know what I am already, which is normal because they're completely changing. So that gives them anxiety that there's something wrong with them. And they might go to an extreme and trying to prove that they are something. Look, one thing with the LGBT stuff, if families are really concerned about that, they need to talk to their schools about it. They have every right to withdraw their kids from anything that goes on curriculum-wise for religious reasons. And they need to communicate with schools proactively about that. That is not something that schools are going to be like shocked by. Conservative Christians have a long history of advocating against this type of stuff in this country. It's completely normal and expected a lot. So
sorry guys in Britain, I don't know if you all have the same experience.
yeah, I don't know either. But yeah, they need to send your principal an email, send the teacher an email if you're really so paranoid about this stuff. I put it in my book. I do bring up things pertaining to gender relations in my book. I bring that up. And a core recommendation I give to schools is they should offer a workshop for parents where they review everything that is taught in the curriculum regarding sexual health, and not just sexual health, but romance as well. Because like romance portrayed in literature, I'd say is a whole thing. I mean, the public school system not replicating the values of the families, that is something that families need to make an attempt to rectify by trying to educate the schools. And that's why I've put my materials together, the book and the course, so they can begin doing that. And it can be taught to educators in a comprehensive way, because teaching them about Islam and Islamic values needs to be done that way, because it's an intimidating endeavor for families.
What if someone was to argue that, well, you teach at a public school that's 90% immigrant or 90% Muslim, so it's almost like you're teaching at an Islamic school. So
it's not like teaching in an Islamic school. I teach in a district with about 50 schools, and
yeah.
I do things at the, I was a program coordinator at my school. So I understand very well what's going on at the other schools and stuff and curriculum and all this type of thing. Here in the state of Minnesota, I've consulted with over 24 districts, another dozen in the state of Washington, and I have 12 in 12 states throughout the country. I have people taking my program. So I've talked to educators across the country who are working with Muslim kids. I have a good idea of what is going on in public education stuff. I'm not saying there isn't things to be concerned about. There is, but just number one, if you're really so concerned about with this stuff, even whether you have a kid in public school or not, your local school still has an obligation to serve you.
Yeah.
And they should know why you choose not to send your kid to the public school. So so bring this, this is a whole thing that affects kids too. Because if we have this paranoia about something going on, but that paranoia is just insular amongst ourselves, and then we actually face the non-Muslims who we think are doing this, and we play nice with them, or we put up a different face like everything's okay, what message does that send to the kids? That sends the message to the kids that we don't actually have the courage to confront these issues. So I say to people, if you're really so concerned about this, you have every right to advocate for your kid and what you want.
We do have that kind of stuff going on in Virginia, by the way. Muslim communities.
Yeah, I know.
Very outspoken about it.
Yeah, lots of Muslim families do. One thing, a reason why I suggest people proactively bring my program to schools is because you can get these conversations going, but not from a point of conflict. You can teach them comprehensively about Islam and the values that we want in our families. And then that base is set when you have this conversation, because proactive advocacy is better than reactive advocacy. And a lot of the advocacy that does go on is reactive. So a teacher might have said something or shown something or done something in the class that families weren't happy about, and then they go complain about it. And they should do that. And that's more of what I see happening. Too, also, people need to get a grip of the laws regarding sexual health curriculum vary greatly from state to state. And Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and I believe Louisiana is the other one. They actually have education about this stuff banned in those states. So there's very, very few states. California is a whole concern. So is Oregon. Washington is getting there as well. So the West Coast states are kind of concerned in some of the things they're trying to pass. But there's very, very few states where education about sexual diversity is something that is mandated.
All right, brother. So I'm back now.
I was talking about, you had asked me about LGBT stuff, and I was going on that. And in some, actually maybe because I have some research I can bring on that. That's maybe something we can dig into some of the details about, because the details do matter. Something I wanted to add to it, like, there is some well-funded activist organizations out there, AstroTurf organizations, sometimes funded by major companies, that are advocating for this stuff out there. There are, they seem to be thriving off of people's paranoia at the same time. And it's especially if Muslims let their paranoia about this prevent them from advocating within the public schools. That would be a complete misperception. That, again, some of these activist organizations, and they might call themselves like a consultancy firm, they'll put together a really a curriculum with really inappropriate stuff and this type of thing. And then they might list on their website that they've consulted with this district or whatever. Now having consulted with a district doesn't necessarily mean that district has adopted their curriculum wholesale. And we have a situation with a district in Minnesota just recently have this go on, where everyone started getting paranoid about, they're teaching this, and that to the kids because this organization says they consult with the school district. And then the curriculum that consultancy firm has on their website says this, and that. But the layers between that consultancy firm having this thing on their website and it actually getting into a classroom, there's a lot of things in between that prevent that. And again, I'm not look, things people have to understand. There's a large gap between this type of thing, the perception of what this school is trying to do or what that advocacy group is trying to say should be taught, and what is actually mandated to be taught in schools. There's a big gap between that. There's very, very few states where sexual diversity is actually mandated to be taught. And maybe I can bring some things, we can have a follow-up where we pull some of this apart. Another thing too that people don't understand, public school teachers, they vote for the Democratic Party at like a 90% rate, but long-range surveying has shown, large-scale surveying has shown that the average public school teacher is more socially conservative than the average American. So you know, and
I think that's a mind blower.
Yeah, especially when it comes to you know, ideas about laws that pertain to protection of children, such as banning abortion, banning pornography, this type of thing. So there are plenty of empathetic ears within the public school system, particularly with the actual teachers teaching our kids. And again, I know this firsthand from consulting with a lot of educators. So, you know, you know, we need to reach out for those things, and that's some other data that
yeah, definitely we should
we
continue this
that
conversation.
type of stuff, you know,
I feel like you've given a lot of hope to anyone who is in public school or parents that may have to face the choice of putting their children in public school, which is why I asked the question, do we have any statistics on outcome between kids in Muslim schools versus kids with public schools? I think that'd be a very good discussion for next time. As well as I had one brother reach out to me himself after my Lost Boys video, and he said that he himself is a lost boy looking for a path in life. So I think that would be a great thing to talk about, inshallah, because you were recommending that we need more Muslim teachers, Muslim male teachers.
And especially some of these young men who did not like school. And me personally, I was not a good student in school and I didn't like school. If you had that experience, that actually makes you a good teacher, which is counterintuitive, and it makes you valuable in a school. Because when you had that experience, you can better relate to and engage the kids who are having that experience in the current time. Whereas a teacher who likes school themselves, they don't know how to relate to those kids.
Definitely, inshallah. So then that gives us about three topics to talk about next time, inshallah, which is...
And I have some specific studies too, where gender studies departments have looked at schools who try to implement sexual diversity, quote unquote, programs. And what they typically find is the teachers make a decision to not really teach about it for various reasons.
And nothing can happen to them because of the teachers union that you were explaining in the beginning of the video. Yeah.
Exactly. And if they are getting pressure from parents, that's a huge factor, because there's nothing that schools respond to. You know, educators get pressure from all over the place, but the last thing schools and teachers want is for the parents to be unhappy with them. Because when you have a kid in the school or the classroom and the parents are unhappy with you, that's stress no one wants to deal with. So they are responsive to parental advocacy. A lot of times we don't fully understand the rights that we have and actually the power that we have with having so many kids in the school system, because the Muslim population is young overall.
Alhamdulillah. So I guess the key takeaway of this video is that for Muslims, you know, it might seem like we're doing really bad and we look down upon ourselves a lot, but it seems that statistically we're doing better than we think we are. Alhamdulillah.
I agree with that, especially relative to the society in general.
Alhamdulillah. That's a really good that's a really good fact. Alhamdulillah. So I'm very happy about that. Inshallah, I guess next time we can talk about the difference of outcome between public and Islamic schools, and we can talk about this LGBT curriculums and how they're being implemented or even not being implemented, as you were discussing. And then the third thing, inshallah, was for people watching this video who may not have a job in mind or really any goal or direction in life, inshallah, Brother Ibrahim is gonna talk about career of being a teacher and why you should do it and the benefits of it, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair for having me on.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you for coming. It's been a real pleasure, brother.
Okay. Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.